Welcome, everybody, to Indivisible TX Lege's monthly Reader Corner series. Today is May 28th. It's Friday, so happy Friday to everybody. We have a Memorial Day weekend ahead of us. We're so glad that you're joining us for this conversation. This month, we read the book There by Tommy Orange, and we are excited to jump into this book and talk about it with all of you. If you've read this book or you look forward to reading this book, let us know in the comments. We love to hear from you and your perspective on this book or your excitement to read this book. Joining us today is Kirk Pate. Hi, Kirk.
Hey, good afternoon.
Antoinette Perez.
Hello.
Lauren Ortel. And Vanessa McDougall. How are y'all doing today?
Very well. Looking forward
Great.
to it.
Good.
Awesome. Well, we're going to start off just kind of doing a roundtable discussion. Each book that we've read has been unique through this series, which I have absolutely loved. And as unique as they are, it still feels like there's these threads between what's happening in real life and also just the thread of these books together. Like, this is a collection of books that really have links between them in different ways. So in discussing this book, I just want to get y'all's thoughts. What did you think about the approach the author took with this book? And with this particular one, if people aren't aware, this is from an urban Native American experience, which is a very unique perspective. How did this book inform you on the urban Native experience, and were you familiar with it before reading this book? So just some thoughts around that. Anybody want to jump in?
I'll jump in because I have a funny connective thread between our last book and this one. One really cool thing about this book that I didn't appreciate the first time I read it when it first came out is that the author, Tommy Orange, plays a lot with perspective. And so with the same character early in the book, he will tell their story for a chapter in first person perspective. But by the end, everything is in third person. And there's a character early named Edwin. And the whole chapter sort of revolves around his inability to poop. And it made me think about our book last month with Trevor Noah.
Yeah.
And how our unexpected lesson from reading that book was everybody shits. And so here we are. Everybody's trying to shit, even if they can't, right? Anyway, I figured I would kick off with that one. As I mentioned, read this book when it came out several years ago and was blown away by it. I consumed it very quickly, like it was just the most delicious dish I'd had. And I think I finished it in a day or two. As a result, I think my eyes were very opened prior to that reading. I had not known much about the modern urban Indian experience, as Tommy Orange calls it, several times in the book. But I don't know. It's like you read the history because you have to when you're in school, and then its factual accuracy is in question. And you grow up and you read other things about that history from actual historians, and you start to see how not great it was. And then there's this huge gap from, Europeans coming to the United States until today for that community. There were gaps for me. So I was really grateful to have read this book several years ago and grateful to be reading it again.
Yeah, same for me. I listened to it the first time I read it years ago when it came out, and reading it now, I don't know how I did that. Keeping track of all the characters. I mean, there were so many times that I flipped back to the beginning. In the print version, there's a list of characters with descriptions and how they're connected and things like that. So being able to flip back and forth was huge on this reread, and I know I got so much more out of it. Antoinette, I also was struck by that structure of shifting from first person. There's one chapter that's second person, where the character is speaking to himself, and then third person. And thinking about that, I feel like that is kind of connected to this larger topic of storytelling, of how there's like the way that it kind of passes on, and how we, originally start with stories for ourselves. And the perspectives will shift, over generations and as they're passed on. So I don't know, I'm curious to learn more about that. I'm actually very, very lucky. I will be working with Tommy Orange in a writing workshop in October with the novel I'm working on. And so I'm so excited to learn from him, and I'm glad that we read this so I could read it again. And I can't wait to hear more about kind of what he was thinking with this. So yeah, I just found it to be an incredible read of just weaving together different people's lives and all the various connections. It's just really cool. So yeah, I loved it.
Well, for me, the urban Native American experience was sort of an entirely new reading experience. I basically had no awareness of anything modern or urban about Native Americans. And, the book largely centers around Oakland, although it does talk from time to time about people's arrival from other cities where there are Native Indian populations, because they all ultimately assemble at a powwow. And so you get something of a sense of the urban setting in which these people live. And you get some of that through the development of, I think it's 12 or 13 characters in the novel and their relationships and so on. So it paints for me, it painted an entirely new picture of, at least in the Oakland area, what the urban Native American experience is, or at least as Tommy Orange presents it. So it's all new to me. And it's a far cry from, say, reading about history. Say, for example, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and other previous works like that. So there's the history, and then there's the novel, although the novel itself talks a lot about history and how it's ingrained in these present day urban Native Americans and their experience.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone else has said. This was my first, exposure to, urban Native Americans. And I mean, I've read books and movies about Indians on the reservation, but yeah, Oakland was new to me. Yeah, and I really enjoyed getting to know the different characters. I appreciated the way the author switched perspective from one chapter to the next, so you see a lot of different characters' points of view. And especially as you start, because initially you don't know any of the connections between characters, and then as you start reading and you realize, like, oh, this character is that character's birth mother and so forth, you start making connections between them.
Yeah, absolutely. This book is definitely unique in terms of its perspective. It has a couple of unique things it does with the structure of how you're reading, as was mentioned. And likewise, just for me as well, this to be able to get the perspective of urban modern Native American characters, there was a couple of things that I felt as I was reading this book. There's definitely a sense of an underlining rage with the characters, and just this sense of injustice, but also this yearning for justice, this yearning for wanting to not feel the way that they're feeling in their life in different ways, and reflecting on what has gotten to them to this point. And I found myself just feeling very emotional reading this book. And there's some key moments that I feel like I could get emotional right now thinking about it. And it's just little moments of how I think one of the characters, Dean, I think is, really similar to the author in terms of description and also function within the book. And we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling, like we mentioned. Will be one of the big themes we talk about. But but there's these moments within Dean's story and coming into that self-realization of being the storyteller and wanting to capture these stories that was very, very powerful reading about. And so I like those moments in those books and in the book. And I just thought that there was a lot of these touchstones within the book of just feeling that real emotion. And it does feel like a page turner, this book. Like, I would sit down and read, 30, 40 pages and feel like, holy heck, how did I just already read all these pages already? And just the flow of the way the writing is and everything was really, really enjoyable. So we have a couple of different themes, different sections that we're each going to kind of lead and talk about. And one of the big themes within this book is cultural identity versus personal identity. Antoinette, I want to hand this off to you to kind of open up this part of the conversation for us around, what this particular theme and some of the reflection you had on it.
Sure. I'm going to use a slightly different entry point, which has to do with what you just mentioned, Alex, that the book flows really well. And the first time that I read this, I raced through it because it was such a page turner. And I felt a sense of urgency to read it. And it moves at a fast pace. Like the entire book takes place in a very short period of time, or at least the action part of it does. All that said, this book has a prologue and it has an interlude. And from a reader standpoint, that the interlude in particular was really good for me, because without it, I wouldn't have stopped and slowed down. Even the first time that I read it, I would have still just like raced all the way to the end. And I was thinking yesterday about how, there are other areas where we see prologues and interludes. I read it on Kindle, and so I'm really nerdy about things like this. But when I got to the interlude, I was like, are we about halfway through the book? And Kindle versions always give you a percentage, and it was like almost right at the halfway point. So it was very satisfying just from that perspective. There's Vanessa's visual of exactly halfway through where the interlude is. But I was thinking about other forms of art that use prologues and interludes, and the first one that came to mind was opera. And I grew up playing music. And so even though I never sang opera, and opera was not like my milieu per se, I played, right, in the orchestra in a couple of different operas. And there are prologues and there are interludes. And one thing that I remember very clearly about the ones that I performed in is that sometimes the themes that were to come later were introduced in the prologue, right? And yet in this book, the tone, the setup, the content of the prologue is not really narrative. It's not told from a character's point of view. It's basically history. It's like context setting. It's a history lesson condensed so that we get that that opening, right, to be able to peek into the stories that we're about to read. I'm not sure who put this statement in our prep document. I didn't write it, so I don't want to take credit for it, but it's really well phrased, so I want to read it. It says, the prologue of There provides a historical overview of how Native populations were systematically stripped of their identity, their rights, their land, and in some cases, their very existence by colonialist forces in America. How did reading this section make you feel? It made me feel ignorant, that I didn't know some of the things that were in there. It made me feel guilty that I didn't know some of the things that were in there. It made me feel a sense of urgency that I had a lot to learn about Native American experience and Native American challenges. And I think those are all really good things, ultimately. What about the rest of you?
I agree with that. Can I tell you guys a story of related to that? So my fifth grader was assigned to write a report in social studies class about Kansas. Like everybody got a different state, he got Kansas. And so we got some books for children about Kansas from the library. And the first two sentences of the first book we read literally said, the first inhabitants of Kansas were the Kaw and Kiowa tribes. Later, Kansas became a US territory. And even Justin, my fifth grader, like spotted like there's a lot like going on here, like later. And I said, the word later is doing a lot of work in this book. And, and it's become kind of a running joke in our family now. Like when you get to the part of the story where you did something you're not proud of, you just like leave it out, like later, all my money was gone. Anyway, I guess that's how it's still being taught or not taught. So yeah, it turns out the Kaw tribe has a website, and so I made him read the history section. We read it together, and that was interesting too, because to me, like, obviously the way you write about history is you start as far in the past as possible, and then you work forward in time from that. And the Kaw Indians do not think of history that way, and their story of their own history was not written in that order. So so that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I felt those emotions as well, Antoinette. So I had known that like Thanksgiving is a problematic concept, like, but the way it is so explicitly stated here, I'm so mad that we still use the term at all. I think this year is going to be the year that I'm going to be that annoying person for all my friends and family to say, we got to stop using this. So I'll just read just the two sentences that explain. In 1637, anywhere from 400 to 700, does anyone know the correct pronunciation of this tribe, Pequot? I've only seen it written, I haven't heard it spoken. Okay, so I'll use Pequot, and I hope it's not incorrect. Gathered for their annual green corn dance. Colonists surrounded their village, set it on fire, and shot any Pequot who tried to escape. The next day, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had a feast and celebration, and the governor declared it a day of Thanksgiving. So it literally means successful massacre. I'm really angry that we still celebrate Thanksgiving and that we still refuse to recognize this history. Yeah, the prologue was really tough and important information. I'm glad he wove it into the story here.
Yeah, I think there was another reference to the marketed story of Thanksgiving that we're told, but then there was a reference one of the characters made the next year or a couple years later, there was so many Native Americans that were poisoned at a meal, and just being shocked by that kind of matter of factness of like, whoa, I don't know this extra story, and just felt like there was pieces of that, like you're saying, Antoinette, were just continuing like this knowledge that was being shared through these characters and perspectives, and really wanting to dig more into this because there's so much that we're not being told. And then also the characters' own frustration of how their stories are being told, of how it feels that it's pathetic or it's pity, and that is not how a people or how Native Americans share their stories or tell their stories of their history and culture and everything. And so it's a complete disservice is not the right word. It's just it's a horrendous thing that we do in terms of learning our history. And Vanessa, your example of that book is a perfect example of that. It's insignificant, doesn't matter. We don't want to go into that. It's we're just going to move on. We're going to say it's there and then move on. Everything's okay.
The prologue and the interlude, for me, served a specific purpose. As Antoinette described, the prologue is basically a very few page historical recounting of what happened to Native Americans. So it definitely set the tone and the framework for the rest of the novel. And there's a quote later in the book, or maybe it's in the prologue, I forget, but it's actually a quote from James Baldwin, that people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. So for me, that prologue served the purpose of describing the history that's reflected in that quote. People are trapped in that history, and the history is trapped in them, meaning present day people carry forward that history in them. And that history that's described in the prologue is played out in the individual stories in the development of the novel. So it definitely, for me, set a very specific tone about and sort of illuminated that quote about people are trapped in history, as described, say, in the prologue, and that history is trapped in the characters who are later developed in the novel, and that history, as each of those characters experiences it, it manifests it in different ways in the development of the characters.
I just did a quick search, and it looks like many Native communities refer to Thanksgiving as Day of Mourning. I'm hoping I'm going to start that. I'm hoping more folks will join me in that. They've been doing that for a long time.
And just a quick tie, we may talk about this a little bit later, but you see the black ribbons that we have on mine and Vanessa's background because we participated with a coalition around a vigil of how this legislative session has gone. And a part of the notion of the vigil is this mourning over the rights that were negatively impacted or were pursued to be negatively impacted. Thankfully some bills didn't pass. But I think reading this book and that day of mourning for Thanksgiving would be a much more appropriate way for us to remember our history and how we've gotten to where we've gotten, and the lack of justice and accountability for what happened with Native Americans in this country.
Yeah, I didn't get to go to that event last night in Austin. I was over in Houston attending a memorial service for somebody. But to your comment about last night's event in Austin, this past session of the legislature has now made us all into sentinels for democracy. We're the ones who have to alert everybody else to the turns that it's taking. And so those black ribbons are appropriate.
Yeah. So that prologue, I think, does a lot of work in helping to establish what the background is and the context is for the cultural identity for Native Americans. The personal identity piece is one that I feel like a lot of the, probably every character in the book questions. Am I Native American? How do I know? What does that mean to me? I went down a big old bunny trail yesterday, and I did not want to drag you all down the bunny trail with me. I happened to get like an update from the New York Times on a scholar an academic who is an expert in Native American studies, who I guess in like 2008 was accused of not being Native, even though she claimed that she was Native American. And this investigative piece went down this path of like trying to establish whether or not she truly was, and how did she stay so relevant and continue to have clout and respect in academic circles when she can't prove that she is Native. And I found this, again, like click, 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 read. This was a piece in Indian Country Today from 2008. This was written by Steve Russell, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, a Texas trial court judge and associate professor of criminal justice at Indiana University, Bloomington, at the time this was written at least. And something that he wrote in here that I still just resonating, I don't know what it means to me yet, if it means anything to me, but it says, If a person who's not tribally enrolled claims to be Indian, the burden should be on the claimant. The test of being Indian is not who you claim, but rather who claims you. And I don't know, it just, it still sits with me. And that was not in our prep document. I have just dropped it in here. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts you want to run with on that one.
Yeah, I have heard that. In one of I spent a lot of time in a Goodreads group where we talk about our books every week, and there's an Indigenous person there, and there have been a lot of these questions about identity and how do you claim something, and that was her response for her tribe. But she said it is different. You know, each tribe might have their own way of how they identify who is part of them. Like she said, for example, with her tribe, it's who's your kukum, who's your grandmother on your mother's side, I believe. And then she also mentioned this, like, it's not you claiming, you know, like you are a part of it based on if that's how the tribe views you. And then, yeah, with enrollment, and, you know, that came up so much in these stories with these different characters of, you know, their different statuses with whether they were enrolled or not. And you felt a lot of the discomfort of, well, you know, my father, who, you know, didn't raise me, was Cherokee, or, you know, something like that. So I don't know if I get to claim it. I don't, yeah, it's really complicated. And I really felt for the characters struggling with that, and how much that means, and how different it is from the story of whiteness in this country, and how that identity came to be, and what that means for folks, and how little most folks who benefit from that identity think about it and think about how they got it and what it means. So yeah, that was a big part of this. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I also thought just the word Indian, right? How the word Indian is used in the book, and you know, there's a character who's you know, multiracial, and he talks about, you know, he doesn't even look Indian. He's been, you know, I think it's Dean who said he's been mistaken as Mexican or Japanese or Salvadorian or all kinds of things. And that you could feel that sense of just personal identity, and the lack of being able to claim that personal identity. But also there's some commentary around the word Indian, and I found it interesting when he was describing a particular scene in the book where there was, you know, a bunch of different, you know, diverse people in a group. And he said, and then there was an Indian / from India / and having to make that distinction, but then also so many of the characters owning the word Indian and you know, identifying as Indian. And so I just, you know, navigating through that and trying to see how the characters responded to that and how he as an author wrote about this, I thought was very, very interesting. And I feel like, you know, as a Mexican American, I feel like there's a lot of similarities in terms of, you know, members in the Latino community trying to understand this identity that, you know, Latinos not a monolith, Native Americans are not a monolith. There's all of these, you know, pieces of diversity and elements of diversity within both groups, and how with being Mexican American, you know, having roots in European ancestry and indigenous ancestry and wanting to navigate that. And so I thought that was just very interesting how he wrote about that, and seeing these characters struggle with that in small moments and some big moments was very, very insightful. And I think is one of the major benefits of this book, of hearing that voice, of hearing a Native American's voice and the characters he's writing, navigating through that space. All right. Well, Kirk, I think we are going to hand it off to you for our next section. This is kind of a part 2 for cultural identity versus personal identity, and some ties to what we saw during the legislative session this year.
Interestingly, yeah. So let's sort of shift gears. The novel provides a great deal for us to think about, contemplate about in terms of the connection between history and our own personal experience. And the interlude chapter in particular, the author claims, and this is a quote from the book, if you were fortunate enough to be born into a family whose ancestors directly benefited from genocide and or slavery, maybe you think the more you don't know, say, about that history, the more innocent you can stay, which is a good incentive to not find out about that history, to not look too deep, and to walk carefully around the sleeping tiger. So for each of us, if we look at our own last names and think about the connection between history and our personal experience, and we follow it back, we might find that our lives too are paved with gold, or, as the author says, beset with traps. In other words, we could find that we too may have benefited. And so I got to thinking about that. But the first thing that came to my mind, which I'll spin off on and then we can discuss further, is it happens to be this House Bill 3979, which is an education bill in the legislature. And there are provisions of that bill that, to me, try to avoid that looking back and thinking about how we may have benefited. And so some of those provisions would prevent social studies or teaching, say, one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. It would prohibit an individual by virtue of individual's race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive. So it's the prescriptions of what you can't teach, to me, all of a sudden resonated and sort of brought to life the quote from the book, and that is that maybe the more we think about the less we think about it, the more innocent we can remain. And so it also has me thinking back to about, say, my own family name, my grandparents, their names, and so on, and whether somehow I became the beneficiary of either genocide or slavery. And I can't quite follow my own personal history back far enough to say in some specific terms how I may have benefited. But what about the rest of you? Have you thought about your personal family name history and its connection with your own personal experience? And have you committed to learning more about the historical foundations of the U.S. that led to genocide and slavery, and whether even our own ancestors may have been beneficiaries of it?
Yeah, a few years ago, I asked my parents, I have very different families, my dad's side, my mom's side. And what I've noticed is we know very little. My last name is German. We assumed we were pretty much all German on my dad's side. On my mom's side, Irish, Scottish, and that's kind of all we knew. And so, asking my dad about how did we get here? And could we have had slaves? Could we have, is there any possibility there? And he kind of talked through what he knew, which wasn't very much. He knew his parents and how they lived in Illinois and then moved to California. And beyond that, it's really fuzzy, which makes me think, compared to this book how little storytelling there is in my family. And my mom's side is very difficult situation where there's just not a lot there. And my brother a couple of years ago did the sending off your DNA thing. And through that, we found that my mother's father was in fact not, which was very good news because he was a very bad person, that it was celebrated when he died years ago. So, so that was interesting. So we found that we actually do have a living grandparent, and it also broke down our DNA and like where that comes from in the world. And it was less German than we thought, also like English and French and all these things. And I was like, oh, you know, like all the boring places, like it was just like all of that, like Western European. And we have 13% Ashkenazi Jew. So that was kind of the only surprise. And my brother was like, yeah, but that's a good thing. You know, if we had some like little pieces of African descent and things in there, that would be through rape. And I was like, that's a really good point. You know, a lot of folks who have these mixed histories, there's so much of that. And thinking also about Indigenous, Alex, what you were talking about, you know, with your identity and that ethnicity being this mix of the white colonizers from Spain and Portugal, wherever, and then Indigenous folks in different parts of this area. So yeah, it's a lot to think about, and I definitely want to learn more. And I just see that there's definitely that, you know, the less we know, the easier it is on us, which is really problematic. So I'd like to change that.
Well, something you said, Lauren, makes me think that in my instance, I can't find what you would call sort of a direct connection between my personal experience or my family's history and genocide, the benefits of genocide or slavery, as the author puts it. But at the same time, I'm keenly aware of the economic system that was created by virtue of slavery, and not just in the U.S. Slavery was not limited to the U.S., but certainly in the South, the economy was in large part a slave-based economy for a long time, even with the remnants of it after the Civil War. The closest that I could possibly connect my own family history to that is my grandfather McDowell, who was born in 1891. And the way that family dealt with Blacks was sort of a leftover from that slave economy. And so it does, you know, that the author's statement that I read at the outset does get me thinking about connections, although I don't personally feel like I have benefited, as the author puts it, from slavery. But it does get you thinking about it. And the other thing that statement gets me thinking about it is the nature of the provisions in HB 3979. And are they intended to obscure what happened, responsibility, and somehow serve as a mechanism for maintaining innocence, putting distance between people today and what happened before by prohibiting discussion of certain topics? So anybody else, can you reflect on any possible personal connections?
I might challenge that a little bit with the struggling to find the direct connection to benefiting from slavery. I think maybe we can think back to a previous book in caste. So maybe more thinking, how do we benefit from the caste system that shows that white folks in this country are going to have more access to jobs? You know, we might have been born into a situation where we had a stable living situation. We had, you know, maybe some kind of cushion to go get an education, to, you know, take an unpaid internship, different things like that, where you have that net that a lot of folks don't have. And also our country was built by slaves. Our Capitol building was built by slaves. It burned down. The one that we have now is built by convict leasing, which is slavery, which we still have. So everything we use, even today with prison labor, slavery, they make a lot of the things that our license plates, our state agency furniture, like all kinds of stuff. So it really is everywhere.
I think it's a really, really good point, that the manifestations of the caste system in one way or another, whether we are conscious of it or not, made us beneficiaries of the caste system. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, kind of reflecting on this part, that's, maybe you think the more you don't know, the more innocent you can stay, which is a good incentive to not find out, to not look too deep, to walk carefully around the sleeping tiger. And we saw with HB 3979, critical race theory is the villain in the room. Critical race theory is what is hurting our future. And it's really around trying to keep white supremacy intact. It's around, not wanting to have these conversations, not wanting to have these stories, not wanting to understand the connection between everything that we're doing and what you're talking about, Kirk, around people understanding their history. Why don't we know our history more? Because so many, practices and cultural norms are to not remember our history. It's to move on. It's, America is around me living my history and reinventing myself is some of the lore that we hear around, Americanism and things like that. And it's just a convenient way to kind of wash away and forget about the sins of the past. And so I think what we saw with HB 3979 and what we're seeing in local communities at school boards and with school districts around trying to push back against critical race theory or even racial equity work, which they are linking together as something that, these are both villains that we need to get rid of, is a real problem we're having in Texas and a real problem we're having in America. And so this book is an opportunity to reflect on some of that and to look at why this is so horrendous, why this type of legislation is so hurtful, and what it robs all of us from in terms of really being able to understand the real stories of our communities, of our families, of our history, so that we can continue to work together instead of taking this path of trying to break down different populations for the gain of one particular part of the population, which is what the caste system, as we mentioned, is all about. And so it's pushing against those elements. And I just think that it's so profound, that little piece there in thinking about how our legislature and how our leaders go about passing policy and how they approach education and why public education is being attacked so much, because it's supposed to be the great equalizer is what we're supposed to think it is, but it's designed not to do that. And whenever there is some equity work or even equality work that's being done, they want to change the rules and they want to change the game and they want to rig it so that people can't get beyond the spaces that they want them to be. All right, up next, we are going to dive into the interlude a little bit. Vanessa, kind of hand it off to you and just kind of dig into what that did within this story and kind of how it reflects with our own work that we do with Indivisible TX Lege and a lot of organizations across Texas.
Okay, so for those in our audience who haven't read the book, the interlude shows up halfway through, and after we've met a lot of characters and had some very fast moving plot, we stop that for a chapter, and he starts with explaining what a powwow is and what it looks like, and then going into there's a subsection called blood, which is goes into the the blood quantum and like who like quote unquote counts as Native American, but of course also in the sense of the massacres covered at the beginning of the book, and then last names, explaining Native Americans didn't used to have European style last names and how that all came from. And then at the end he starts talking about gunfire and massacres, which this was my first time reading the book, and it was upsetting to me because up till this point I was hoping maybe they'll pull it out and the powwow will be okay. But after reading this section about death and gunfire, like they're not going to make it. And yeah, and it so the context of the Big Oakland powwow, I think, was really helpful for most of the readers who didn't realize that there were still powwows or couldn't quite picture what an urban powwow would look like in the 21st century. And yeah, I really liked how he got into the details about like what kinds of people were there, and and things like were urban Indians and indigenous Indians, res Indians and Indians from Mexico, Indians from 8 different tribes with water blood quantum requirements, and so not federally recognized Indians. And describing their their bumper stickers and their music, and it really helps picture what's going on here. And from a storytelling perspective, it also kind of briefly lets us breathe, and because after a lot of dense storytelling and trying to keep track of dozens of different characters, it's like, okay, like you can stop worrying about the characters for a minute, and and here's some more background and scenery. But then at the end, like, and by the way, like this is headed to a very bad place, just and it kind of made me think about where we are with the Texas legislature in time. We're wrapping up the session, so kind of the stage has been set and the bills have moved through, all the bad bills have moved through, the HB 3979 banning critical race theory, and the voter suppression bills, and the heartbeat bills, and just like they've all moved through, but they haven't taken effect yet. And so in that way, I feel like our state is kind of in an interlude where like the stage has been set, but the suffering that these bad bills are going to bring has not actually begun, but we can all kind of see what's coming.
That interlude serves for me a number of purposes that you kind of touched on. One is, it's a lot about identity, where there's the discussion of the last names, or the acquiring of last names, or and issues about blood mixture and so on. But relating to the legislature, well, the other thing the interlude served was to I didn't know it at the time, but it was really sort of pointing ahead to the outcome at the powwow, which was tragic. But the other thing that it does, it sort of takes stock in the middle of the novel. And I think your reference to the legislature, I mean, we might call it, we get together and debrief, right? But I think to call it an interlude, and we think about the opportunity we have right after the end of the session and have an interlude and sort of take stock and reassess, and all is an appropriate sort of an analogy. And so it may cause us to think about what's just happened as well as where we're going, which is what the interlude did in the book, about identity and where we're going. And so it served the novel really well as a literary device, but I think it could serve us well also in terms of our involvement in monitoring the legislature.
Going back to Vanessa's comment about the powwows and maybe how some of us don't have a lot of experience with that. So I cover both Texas and New Mexico in my position, and it's actually kind of a relief. Things are so much nicer in New Mexico. So seeing how government can actually help people and do the right thing is a little bit of a relief sometimes. And also the populations are very different in the two states. The latest, which is probably from the last census, so it will be updated. I doubt it'll change significantly. Population numbers I found were that in Texas, only 0.3% of our population is indigenous or identifies that way. In New Mexico, it's almost 11%. And so these cultures and knowing about different tribes and working with tribal communities and things like that is so much more present in other states compared to Texas, which is really devastating to think about when you know there were so many different tribes and pueblos in this area, and they've pretty much all been run off and killed off. If anybody else here has looked up which land they're on, I'm on Tonkawa land in Austin, and I think 3, maybe 4 people who identify as indigenous or native in Austin, and that's hard to come by in Texas. So it makes sense that a lot of us wouldn't have a lot of exposure to this. I hope a lot more people get educated like this. We're working on an Indigenous education anti-racism program in New Mexico right now. And we've been invited to the Apache powwow in September, which I'm very excited about, but I'm also going to very much have this book in my mind with that and, see what I can learn there. And just, there's just so much with that. Also, it was kind of interesting. I was flying last night as I was finishing this book and landing in the Oakland airport, which I've never flown into before, but just reading a book taking place in Oakland as I was in Oakland was interesting, and also made me think about the different geographies and how we have different exposure to these communities and these stories.
Totally random, but isn't the Oakland airport the one where you land and you feel like you're about to hit the water, and then out of nowhere, there, like, the landing strip is there? Yeah, so freaky.
Very much.
That had to be such a unique experience to read this book that takes place in Oakland and has, so many elements of the story are about Oakland, and then to be landing there. That's a unique experience that you had, Lauren. That's
we saw the Coliseum last night. I was looking around at all the street signs to, because they mentioned the streets and things like this, and I was trying to, absorb it all last night. And I'd love to learn more though.
Yeah, and Vanessa, I like what you talked about in terms of us being in our own interlude before we feel the outcomes and effects of some of these bills, and it really feels like in organizing that's a lot of our work, is that because of the situation we're in with Texas, and we don't have the leadership that is really there to serve, to be public servants, but they're there instead to serve the economic interest of those that they care about and those who are at the top of the caste system. we have a lot of this undue suffering that ends up happening because of these legislative priorities that get pushed through. And for us to read this book at this time of the ledge when it's wrapping up and having experienced the chaos and exhaustion from this ledge, and then to still know that we have the future to look ahead, which at the moment there are going to be some bad things coming because of this legislation. It's just a good opportunity to reflect, and hopefully for everybody, it's also a good opportunity to figure out how we can get recharged and plugged in and understand that our work is not done. And I know for some people, I've heard some organizers across the country where in some states after the Biden election, they felt like their job was done, that everything's okay for them and everything. But in Texas, we know very much that our work is still needing to ramp up. We still need a lot more efforts and work to do because we have a state legislature that is completely committed to negatively impacting so many parts of our communities.
Yeah, and fixing the power grid, like the one thing everybody in Texas agreed had to get done this session, did not get done.
Yeah,
we're gonna just keep freezing in the dark, I guess.
Well, for this summer, there's some concern around whether we're going to have some shutdowns during the summer, and so it's like it's one of those things of we had this happen in February, we could have solved it, we don't solve it, and now we may have some issues in the summer which will cause more suffering, which we just heard the report that over 700 Texans they're counting right now had died from the Texas freeze. And so and for what benefit? It's definitely not to serve the public. It's definitely not to help us have quality of life and all the things that we want to try to accomplish individually and collectively. It's simply for some profit and benefit of people at a certain part of the caste system.
The people who can fly to Cancun.
Yes, exactly. Well, our next section that we're going to jump into is around the storytelling. You've heard us reference this a few times because it is such a major theme of this book. And Lauren, I want to hand it off to you, just kind of give some thoughts on the storytelling aspects and the theme of this book, and we can dive into it.
Yeah, thank you. It was so present, and I loved that. There were a couple quotes that I marked. When you hear stories from people like you feel less alone. When you feel less alone and like you have a community of people behind you, alongside you, I believe you can live a better life. So there's this project in the background, and I love how he gets the grant money, even though there's some term that he uses like the content will determine the outcome or something like that, which is so
the vision, right?
Yeah. It's like he essentially said, I just want to let people talk and share their stories. I don't know what the end product's going to be. I can't give you all these measurables. I can't, and that he still got it. I was like, oh yes, like we need to step away from this like very structured, like what's the outcome? How are you going to measure your success? And sometimes it's just about that human connection. So I loved what he was doing through the storytelling project and how that was woven throughout the whole book here. And there was something on page 137 about, so this is the wound that was made when white people came and took all that they took has never healed. An unattended wound gets infected, becomes a new kind of wound, like the history of what actually happened became a new kind history. And these stories that we haven't been telling all this time, that we haven't been listening to, are just part of what we need to heal. Not that we're broken, and don't make the mistake of calling us resilient. To not have been destroyed, to not have given up, to have survived is no badge of honor. Would you call an attempted murder victim resilient? I really like this powerful call out of how we have some incorrect storytelling, and I'll let more folks jump in on some of the how the stories we tell ourselves about this country. through, whether it's through history and how that's going to be changed, unfortunately, with this terrible bill with education, but also just thinking about the importance of this, and especially from underrepresented voices. So I read a lot of fiction, and I also love memoir, and that's stories. You know, it's different people's stories, different things that people come up with based on their lives, other people's lives, and imagination. And so the more we can learn about other people to connect with them if they're outside of our culture, or the more that people can see themselves represented in books and film and shows, like it's, I don't know, I just really hope that it can help with the wounds of what has happened in our country and what continues to happen to a lot of people. So I know there are lots more thoughts on this, so I'd love to hear from y'all on storytelling and what that looks like in the US and how that differs in different communities.
I'm ready to jump in, but I would love to hear from someone else first before I jump in.
Well, storytelling plays a huge role in the novel. The fact that there is storytelling at all is one of the things that unites the urban, Native American community, or even as dispersed as they are geographically. Storytelling is a mechanism that unites. The stories themselves, or the content of the stories, can relate to ancestry, but oftentimes the storytelling relates to family life, the tragedies that have gone on in families. But the individual stories sort of tell who you are. It's a way of communicating something about who you are to other people, both in terms of Native Americanness, let's say, as opposed to sort of where are you at this point in your life. So it's a huge literary tool to weave people together, and so it plays just a huge role. I think on the excuse me, at least related in my own thinking to this HB 3979. HB 3979 goes in the direction of to sort of predefine what the outcome should be, outcome of storytelling should be, by saying this is what you can read about and study and tell about, and this is what you can't read about and study and tell about. And so that's an intervention of a sort that makes storytelling, a very different kind of experience if you put it in the context of legislation. It serves a completely different kind of experience than storytelling did in the novel itself.
The storytelling that was so powerful for me in this book made me think a lot about our work as organizers and activists. And even my own work professionally, as a public speaker and a public speaking coach. I have been focused on the last few years and working exclusively with women of color. I knew that storytelling was something that I had to help people get better at. I hadn't put it in those terms because I don't think I'm a great storyteller myself. And so reading this book and putting, all of this great inspiration into action kind of said to me, like, maybe I really have to get better at storytelling for my own work as an activist, and also so that I can help other people, both in my volunteer work as well as in my professional world.
And storytelling really ties into what the work we do in Indivisible, right? Because that's kind of Indivisible 101 is advocate, for policy changes by telling your story. And especially in the Texas Ledge, since any Texan can go to these committee hearings when the legislature is in session and testify on any bill, if you have the time and, you know, geographical proximity or flexibility, it can be a really powerful tool for advocacy. And I've had, so I live in Austin and I have a flexible job, so I get to spend more time hanging around the Capitol than a lot of people. But it's something I want to see us all get better at, is tying, you know, the sometimes legalistic wording of the bill to how it affects our lives. And well, okay, if we allowed more remote education, like what does that mean for parents, for students, for, you know, for educators, or you know, I think it's a really powerful tool we have to change the narrative. That, because I think especially people in the right wing tend to think of these things as like, you know, games or intellectual exercises, or like, oh, I don't know, I'm just intellectually curious. Like if you let anybody sue anybody related to an abortion, like I wonder what would happen, and tie that to, well, you know, but explaining how, you know, that really puts people in danger, and, you know, tie that to real people's lives, I think is a powerful tool we have in Indivisible.
Yeah, so I absolutely love this theme about storytelling in the book, and definitely agree with you, Vanessa, that that's a big part of our work. And you know, as a grassroots organization that's trying to engage more and more Texans to participate, because it is all of our stories, it is the impact for all of us, and why we want to make sure that we have legislators and legislation that are going to help us in our own paths, but also help us collectively, you know, to be able to move forward as a state into whatever the future is going to bring. And as we've seen over this past year and a half, we don't always know what the future is going to bring. We don't know a pandemic is going to hit, when it's going to hit, and things like that. And for me, just the theme of storytelling is such an important anchor in my own life, and how I am as a parent. When I talk to my daughters and we're navigating through different subjects at school, and either they're trying to get their head wrapped around a math problem, or they're trying to get their head wrapped around social studies or science, I always tell them, you know, it's at the end of the day, you're just trying to understand the story. You know, for math, this is the story of numbers, and here's the characters that are involved in this story, and here's what's going to make the outcome of this story. You just want to understand how to interpret and be able to move through the story through numbers, and whether it's science or anything else. And so we watch a lot of films, and it's a real big foundation for us as a family to talk about stories and how we connect with each other, and how things are impacted through these decisions that each of us can make, and decisions of our past, and what decisions we'll make in the future, and things like that. And so this theme just is something that in Dean's mission in this book, to collect these stories, is one of the most like emotional pieces for me, in terms of that desire, and what the author Tommy Orange is doing. And there's a moment with his uncle early on in the book where he gets this camera from him, and his uncle is ill, and always had this dream, and is a storyteller himself. And his Dean's mom, who is the sister to his uncle Lucas, says, "Oh, when he says he's working on, he just means it just means he has this idea. He's not actually working on it," and things like that. But there's this yearning to be a storyteller that his uncle has. And this moment when he picks up the camera and he says, "It's like the lens was my uncle being able to see." And what the lens of a camera is able to help us do in order to be able to see each other, and why in our organizing we want to capture these stories, we want to capture footage, we want to have this Zoom session, we want to catalog the work that we're doing, so that this is the story that people understand of how we can do better in Texas, and how we can do this work. And so just all the elements of this theme I feel are so powerful, and really get to the core of me as a person, because Antoinette, you say you don't feel like you're a good storyteller. I think that is just completely incorrect. And I think you're an amazing storyteller. And I see myself in my own work, that storytelling, I'm a big process guy. I've worked in a lot of operations work, business operations and things like that. At the end of the day, any process, anything that's happening, whether it's a check coming into the business and then a piece of paperwork has to go out or a check has to go out, that process, the way I view it all, is from a story. What's the story of this steps that need to happen for this to do what it needs to do or what we're trying to accomplish? And so the more we can celebrate storytelling and the more we can lean into storytelling and the more we can appreciate storytelling from diverse perspectives, the more I think we have what we'll need to solve whatever problems we need to solve. And I think this book is a perfect example of that. In all of my desire to read as much and watch as many films, Native American stories, Indian stories are definitely not enough in the catalog. And so with Tommy's Orange's book here, it was just a reminder of how many stories I'm not thinking about and how many perspectives I'm not thinking about and how beneficial it was to be able to read this story. So yeah, I love this theme. I could probably go on another hour talking about this, but the last thing to wrap up our conversation is just a note around how storytelling helps us be interconnected with each other. And this is really our pathway to be able to move forward in the ways that we need to move forward. And reflecting on the visual and all of the speakers. If you haven't had a chance to see that, it's on our Facebook page, it's on our YouTube page. You can see all the speakers talking about various issues and how they shared their stories and the impact and the work that we need to do in organizing. And it's really understanding that, we are in this together as human beings. We have this one planet, we have these resources. And as much as we try to silo ourselves away from each other or be in our own forts, in our own homes or whatever it is, we still have this world that runs and operates based on all the actions that we do and all of the decisions that we make. And so our hope as an organization, and we hope it's everyone's hope, is that we are trying to have as fulfilling a life as possible so that people can pursue and realize their talents and their abilities and have the fullest life possible in this experience that they're going to have. And legislation and government plays a key part of that because it sets the rules, it sets the landscape, it sets the barriers of what can and can't be done in certain areas. And so when those things are restricting us and people's identity or life is being restricted in so many different ways, and decisions are being taken out of their hands, that's not what we want to see. We want to be able to let everyone make those decisions and have as much, of the what's the word I'm thinking of? Just the capacity to make those decisions for their own life and to be able to do that, but also for us to be in harmony with each other as much as possible of how we're trying to help each other through this. So final notes on interconnectedness and why we do the work we do across this great state. We're all in different parts of the state. We work with coalition members and organizations across the state in this work. It's absolutely necessary. Any final thoughts on interconnectedness that y'all have?
Well, in the story, the ending is absolute tragedy. And it is, I think a part of it is the individualist mindset. People maybe making a selfish decision. Of course, I think this was kind of in the broader context of the massacres and colonization and everything that was done in this land. But just this idea of how much we lose and how much our actions, no matter how small, can affect other people, and thinking about that. So yeah, it definitely connects to the work that we're trying to do. I'm glad, Alex, you mentioned how this helped you think about people's stories that you might not have thought about before. So as we're moving forward, now we're thinking about which candidates are we going to be supporting? what are the primaries? What are these things going to look like as we're focusing on the midterm elections, where we really hope to see some huge changes? So how can we be more thoughtful about who we're engaging with, which stories we are being intentional about hearing and including and prioritizing? So yeah, I think this book provides a good lesson to consider as we move forward in our work and everything that's ahead.
Well, something that's just sort of come to mind about stories, both in the novel as well as present day stories we tell each other. By telling, as a communication device, telling a story has a potential of relating to somebody else's story. And so the interconnectedness in part comes from the fact that somebody tells a story, and even just listening to the story, you connect your own story to it. And when that happens from person to person to person, you have this interconnectedness. And the interconnectedness in a cause brings about, it increases strength and capacity is what it does. And so the storytelling is weak, and perhaps there are ways that we could develop that further within Indivisible TX Lege and use it more as a reinforcing mechanism to enhance the power that the organization has and the capacity to get its work done.
I think going into this session, we were focused so much on how social media could increase our group's reach. And after reading this book, I felt pretty clear that storytelling might help us increase our reach faster than anything else.
The thing that just occurred to me about that, Antoinette, is it's hard to refute your story, okay? You can develop stories about the impact, say, of legislation on people's lives. It's hard to refute my personal story. And so as a means of communication and advocacy, a story becomes more powerful because it's very difficult to refute somebody's personal story.
It's not difficult for some people to refute other people's personal stories. And I think this is another reason why when we talk about advocacy and benefits that sometimes white folks have, is that their stories tend to be believed at a higher rate than I think people of color and marginalized folks. So yeah, I hear you, Kirk. I mean, for those of us that are empathetic people naturally, we don't refute other people's stories. For folks who flee to Cancun when things get chilly outside and, whatever, they promise their kid, blah, 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 whatever. Refuting other people's stories, remaining ignorant of other people's stories, that's a pastime. That is a skill they have honed over many, many, many years. I hear you, though. I get what you're saying. There's just this little part of me that felt like I needed to clarify that.
Yeah.
It's harder to repeat somebody's story than, statistics or something, maybe. Not impossible if you're really determined not to care about anyone but yourself.
But we know a lot of those people through this legislative session. We know so many of them by name and by voting record.
Yeah, and I think that's where when we talk about things like relational organizing, and maybe our job is not to try to convince these horrid legislators who are so willing to ignore the stories of so many Texans and only push the agenda. And Vanessa, what you said in terms of, what their purpose is, it's, whether it's like an intellectual, like this is just a giant game for them. And so this is, part of why they don't care. They think of money and things, it's a gamification of the economy for them. versus the actual public service that is needed. Maybe our stories for those people are not what's needed, but it's the stories with each other, so that we are organizing, so our power is increasing, and so that we are in this together, so that we can actually elect the leaders that are going to reflect the values and the direction of what we want to see happen in our state. And I think that's where that opportunity and that power in our stories can be best, made. Antoinette, to your point around, the best thing we could do as an organization is just keep telling stories and try to include more storytelling in our work, in the stories of others, because that's where the power is, and that's where the change needs to happen. They have already shown publicly that they don't care, and even if they do their apology tour, which we've been referencing Ted Cruz, who's the villain of Texas, one of the major villains of Texas, running to Cancun and everything like that, and even his fake apology that he gives and reasoning and everything. At the end of the day, he has shown publicly he does not care about Texans. He does not care about serving Texans. He just cares about being a player in the game that he's participating in for the benefit of himself and the few that he cares about. And so we are pawns in his eyes. And so this is not the kind of world we want to live in. It's not the kind of government society we want to live in or have. And so it's our stories with each other that we can help empower each other, so that we are the ones in position to make those decisions. And we have people who share our values in making those decisions. And so that way we don't have to waste our time with them. Because one thing about this advocacy we experienced this ledge session is it's exhausting, it's tiring, it is definitely feels defeating. And we can keep working hard this way and having the small victories that we've had. And small victories also is because something bad didn't pass, or we can work together to put people in position so that we are working together for solutions that will actually help people. And I think that's what's exciting in seeing the coalition work that's being done, and how Texans are coming together under our own organization to work together, and how much we can double, triple, quadruple, 100 times down that work, so that the power is in the hands that we want, so that we can move forward in the direction that we're all yearning for. And that was a part of that book. The book is the characters are yearning for this justice, because their ancestry, their people has been broken, defeated, and no one knows how to talk about it, and no one knows how to share it. And at the end of the day, there's a yearning for justice there. And let's make that happen. Let's organize together. Let's have people power, and let's get Texas to where we want it to be. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. This is the book There There by Tommy Orange. We highly recommend this book. A couple of Lauren, Antoinette, you've read it twice. I think I'm going to be on that pathway as well, reading it more than once. It's an amazing book, and we hope you join us next month. We will be announcing our book for next month here, probably in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned for the last couple of days of the Ledge session. If there's anything that needs to be done, any actions, and stay tuned to us, because there is no off season. We're going to keep working, and we're going to keep doing amazing things for a better and brighter future in Texas. So thank you so much for being a part of it. Thanks, everybody.